You're ready, go ahead.
Actually, I'm going to kick it off with a prayer and like to welcome everybody. Dr. Claire Wright, of course, is our presenter today, and everyone who has been able to join us. This is a prayer that is based on Pope Francis' new encyclical Fratelli Tutti. When our lofty words of love have been emptied of their meaning, when our borders and computer screens have erected impenetrable walls, when our minds are so quick to conflate other with enemy, how will we find our common humanity? It's never too late to make an earnest and tender start. May we remove from our pockets the stones we intend to throw and cement them together to build a home that welcomes all. May we repent of our indifference and move into genuine encounter. Instead of drawing battle lines, may we draw our chairs up to a communal table where we can feast in the knowledge of our shared humanity and dignity. May God grant us the holy vision to see in every human being a sacred mystery, and may we love each mystery not abstractly, but concretely. Just as Thomas touched the wounds of Jesus, may we be unafraid to touch the wounds of our suffering neighbors. May we lay down our arms and offer our outstretched hands until there is no more them, but only us, until we are at last sisters and brothers all. Amen. So I'd like to turn it over to Eddie Adachi to moderate our presentation, our Share the Joy this afternoon. Eddie?
Thank you, Father Marty, for that lovely opening prayer. And thank you to Dr. Wright for being with us today and presenting her joy to all of us, as well as to all the students who are on the call and able to hear her words of wisdom. I'm going to be doing a very short biography that covers a lot of Dr. Wright's academic accomplishments, but that does not speak at all to the type of person she is and to her other characteristics. So hopefully she can share more on that after. But here's a short biography of Dr. Wright's academic accomplishments. Dr. Wright has completed all of her undergraduate and graduate training in the UK and holds a degree in physiology, neuroscience, and neuropathology. Her PhD work was completed in collaboration with GlaxoSmithKline, where she worked in a team to characterize potential new models for Alzheimer's disease. Since her move to Hawaii in 2004, she has focused her research interest in the field of parturition, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, and held several university and local foundation grants before her move to Chaminade. Her research program in Chaminade is funded by the National Institute of Health, and her laboratory of fetal membrane tissue integrity is centered around understanding the mechanisms that control the strength of this tissue during pregnancy, as she is committed to improving women's health, care, and neonatal outcomes here in Hawaii. Prior to Chaminade, she was the primary neuroanatomy instructor at the John A. Burns School of Medicine, and she continues to teach at the medical school and has joint appointments in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Women's Health, and also anatomy, biochemistry, and physiology. She has numerous peer-reviewed publications in the field of preterm birth and has also published in the field of medical education. Her broad background in several areas of the biological sciences and her teaching experience gives her the expertise to teach a wide range of biology subjects and to mentor students who wish to perform translational biomedical research. So we'd like to welcome Dr. Claire Wright.
Thank you so much, Eddie. It's always so weird to hear descriptions of yourself. I think that never goes away. No matter how old you get, you think, are you talking about me? But I really appreciate it. And I hope that doesn't put students off from asking me questions and spending this time together to talk story. Because I was really happy when I was interacting with you guys and thinking about what to talk about today. I'm just going to pull up my PowerPoint to keep me on track. So those of you guys that know me from class know that I'm happy to talk for a while. So I want to make sure I keep on track. So I'm just going to share my screen with you guys and use that to help us. So one of the things I was thinking about this is actually just even going through the process of preparing this talk today made me so happy. It's such a powerful thing. Obviously, you guys have just heard from Eddie that some of my background is in the neurosciences. And so just putting yourself into the mind space of thinking what makes you joyful, just having that experience changes your mood. It changes your perceptions of what's going on around you. So I absolutely had that experience as I was putting together this presentation and trying to decide, first of all, what I would say to you guys, because I didn't want to get too caught in the depths of science. Some of you I've seen are science majors on the Zoom room, and some of you are not, right? So I want to try to explain to you why I love science, why it's super cool, and how it's so multidimensional. And one of my favorite things that I stick on my door when I'm not in class, but when I'm in the research lab, is this sign: science is the poetry of reality. And it says, I'm in the research lab because science is the poetry of reality. And it's one of those things that really, really speaks to me, because once you get onto the cutting edge of new discoveries, science is incredibly creative and a real beauty to behold. So hopefully I can convince you of that. So one of the first things I was thinking about was, you guys all know me. Well, not everyone knows me, but different people in this space right now know me for different reasons. So I've seen faculty on there that absolutely know I'm faculty senate president, and Eddie knows me in that capacity too as well. I'm also the chair of the Human Research Ethics Board for the university. and then some of you guys know me as an instructor, but what a lot of students and faculty don't know is really my love for research, and how that's my first love, as it were. I find all of my other hats, all my other jobs extremely rewarding and joyful as well, but there are other talks, right? So research is my first love, as it were. So one of the things I was thinking about is showing you guys the top 10 or 4 of the top 10 leading in discoveries of 2020. So even though we've been in this lockdown situation and this lockdown environment, there have still been scientific discoveries, right, giving people joy. And so I looked up on the Smithsonian this morning what the leading ones were, and I thought these ones were really super cool. So this one here, it was a discovery that fish fins are as sensitive as our fingers, right? And these were all discoveries that they're saying are going to lead to inventions that will make impacts in people's lives when they come to fruition, right? So this one was, hey, this little fish here has fins that are just as sensitive as our fingers. This is a Pacific sea dragon, and it is super black. Its pigment is super black, and it actually reflects 95.5% of the light. And there are like 15 species they've identified in deep oceans that do that. And whereas the man-made black colors that we use for clothing or textiles or whatever only reflect 10% of light. So there's this little bee here, this is an ironclad bee, and its exoskeleton is so tough. I'm hoping that you can still hear me. It's so tough. You can run over it with your car and it will not die. It's like super cool. And then this little guy, this is a aquatic species as well, but this little guy they discovered makes these, and they are described as this, as snot palaces. So all of these here is like mucus secretions that it's making into these tunnels and an elaborate structure around it to filter the water around it so it can look after itself. And so I just wanted to share this with you because I thought they were super cool. And I thought I wanted to show you like how joyful all of the discoveries can be. And so I was really thinking about, why is science joyful for me? And what I really came up with is that it's multi-layered, that there is some egocentric part of it. That's a self-joy, a self-intellectual challenge, but also that it's bigger than that. You know, we are driven to do science, not just for the sake of discovery itself, but to affect people who we have close relationships with, people within our communities. And if you do biomedical research like me, that can be like global humanity and health. And that's an incredibly powerful vocational drive to do that. And so I thought about COVID vaccine as being a perfect example of that. Those scientists that made that vaccine, that new type of vaccine. So those of you who you know are not so highly scientific trained, maybe not realize how cool that is. The new strategy that we have now to produce vaccines because of this vaccine is completely new. It's completely radical. And so I'm sure those scientists had that moment of self kind of realization and intellectual stimulation and intellectual joy. But obviously this affects the whole world and everyone living in the world, and legitimately saves lives and has huge impacts. So I wanted to tell a story about my own research, literally from last Friday night. I had a breakthrough last Friday night, and I thought I would share that story with you guys. And so I looked to see if any of my any of my students that were in the lab on Friday, and we finished lab at 5:30. And this is what happened to me afterwards. I went home and I was like this. I was so happy because of my breakthrough. I was doing crazy happy dances because what I'd been doing that the students didn't know was been trying to figure out some really messy data for several days that was due at a conference that night at 8 p.m. on the East Coast for presentation. And I was trying to figure out all of this big messy data with all of these variables, and everyone knows in science that's a bad idea and that's not a good thing to do. And I needed to sort it out and try and figure out what was going on. And through the power of math and the power of biostatistics, I was able to tease out some things. And so what I discovered was this. I figured out that the baby during the pregnancy, at the end of the pregnancy, communicates with the mom through its own DNA. So it's been known for a while that DNA is found in the fluid around the baby that comes from the baby, from its dead cells and those kinds of things. It's just normal. But we discovered that it actually communicates to the mom, right? This is one of the things I'm really interested in. How does the mom and the baby communicate with each other throughout the pregnancy? And so our data showed that the baby is able to do this by its own dead cells, that a normal part of its growing and developing is able to do that. And that it's not just that, it actually, the ability for it to communicate well depends on whether it's a boy baby or a girl baby, which was absolutely fascinating to me. And then the last thing we figured out with that data was that actually what's been happening in the pregnancy and how that pregnancy has affected the DNA, so changed it, like for science people, we call it post-translational modification. Other people can let that go, but it changes the DNA, and that affects how well it communicates with the mom as well. And so there's all of this information. That was why I was literally kind of like, oh my goodness, like, how am I going to figure out what is going on with, but by the time I got home, I was like this. I was literally like this in my kitchen. And the thing that's really cool about this that I was thinking was, now in the world right now, the only people that know this are a few people in my research group and you guys. Like literally nobody else in the world knows that because it's brand new data that I haven't shared with anyone. And for me, that was so joyful to figure something out that was tricky to figure out. So I was thinking about this personal joy. Where does it come from? this intellectual joy piece. It comes from pulling together all of the different pieces of the jigsaw, right? So some information that I got from previous experiments, some information that was out there that made me think, oh, I know there's DNA in there. We used to use it to see if the baby was healthy or not, but that's not why it's there. Why is it there? And so putting that together in a jigsaw and is incredibly satisfying, you know, because everyone likes to come up with ideas, see how they think it comes together, right? And to be proven correct, like, is just a wonderful, joyful feeling. Everyone likes to be right, and everyone likes to feel unique that they've come up with something. So that can give you this enormous intellectual joy, and to discover something completely new that's never been known before. The other thing that I was thinking about is just really explaining to you, I could, because of my neuroscience background, explain to you the neurochemistry of delayed gratification. But I don't think any of you really want that at this point in the day. But basically, this is a whole process that happens. We, as scientists, we collect what's known, we figure out what the unknowns are. And some of you guys know this is scientific process. And we systematically figure out experiments to determine the answer, baby step by baby step. Once we get the answer, and we've designed usually our experiments so that we get a yes or no answer. And if you're a good scientist, that's what you're doing. But usually the answer is way more complicated than we ever dreamed it could be. And so my example of my findings on Friday were exactly like that. It wasn't just that I was thinking, oh, I think that DNA is there to communicate with the baby because I know the thing that picks it up. And I've discovered that that is found in that tissue. And so the answer isn't simply yes or no. It is used to communicate with the mom. It was, oh, and what about the sex of the baby? And what about these modifications that can happen to the DNA? And it all played into it. And so this is something that I explained to you hopefully very simply in like a matter of minutes, that took us 1.5 years of experiments that we didn't understand, and we didn't know what on earth was going on. And we didn't get why there was such a mess in the data until you get to this endpoint. You go through this circle over and over again. And the fact that it takes time means then that you are so happy when you finally figure it out. It's kind of a wonderful human thing. So this poster is on my office door, and some of you guys that know it, it's my or have seen it on my office door. It's there as my constant reminder of this is our scientific process. We do experiments, they don't work, we learn from it, and then we repeat, and eventually we come to an answer. So I wanted to share with you guys a couple of things, because it can be really intimidating for students when even science students, when you talk to them about science and about discoveries. And, you know, a lot of students think that you have to be this amazing person that's incredibly special to actually ever do something in science. And I want to completely break that myth. There is absolutely nothing special about me at all, other than I'm very stubborn and I will see things through to the end. But so it was making me think about why I wanted to be a biomedical researcher. And I think, you know, I have a story there that the students might find useful, in that they'll see that I'm not who they think I am necessarily, that I'm very normal, ordinary person. So even though I grew up in London, I grew up in this area of London here in the Northwest that's very Irish, Catholic area. But it's not in the center of London. It's not in a very privileged area at all. And yeah, I was a very normal kind of kid living in an apartment who just always really liked science. And I graduated from high school at 16, the same as my parents, the same as my brother, and went and got a job, right? And so I thought that would be really interesting for you to see actually what this trajectory was. It's not that I went straight from an environment where my parents had gone to university and my elder brother had gone to university. He's a car mechanic and still lives in the UK, as does my family. I went and got a job at 16, and then I decided, no, this is not for me. And so I went back to community college, and then I went on and got my undergraduate degree and my master's degree. And then I still didn't know what I wanted to do. So I worked for a year, and then I went on and got my PhD. And so I think often that really surprises students, that their faculty's trajectory is not straight. It's life experience, and there are many things that we see and we understand about trying to make decisions about where you're going with your life, and just being true to what makes you joyful and what gives you that kind of vocational drive. It's very important. But I ended up in Hawaii because even after getting my PhD, I worked in England for a while, right? I worked with Glaxo. I built upon my PhD work. I worked at Imperial College, which is a school simply for sciences and engineering, right? It's a university that just does that. And then I moved to Hawaii, right? And I worked at the med school. I was there as a postdoctoral fellow. I began my research program. I was teaching neuroanatomy to the students and an introduction to psychiatry. And then I moved to Chaminade, right? And students often ask me, why did you move to Chaminade? And I sometimes say, well, because Dr. Turner is extremely convincing. But she made me realize that what I find professionally rewarding, I would find at Chaminade, and I would be able still to do my research that I love, and to be able to do some things that I couldn't do at the medical school, right? So that hopefully that answers that question for you guys. But it brings me back to this experiment, fail, learn, repeat thing, because we have to acknowledge that there is a lot of heartache involved in that, because experiments do not go as you expect them to. And so what I wanted to explain to you is what gets me out of bed in the morning, right? So when my experiments aren't working well, when I'm tired, when I'm just like, I do not want to do that anymore, it's the bigger picture thing that personally gets me out of bed in the morning. And that is because my research is tied to studying prematurity in Hawaii. And that is an extremely impactful area of research that needs to be studied, that I feel really, really passionately about. Because prematurity is something that is at really high rates in the US in a way that it's not actually in the UK. In Hawaii, our rates are high. In the US, our rates are high. It's 1 in 10 babies that are being born premature, and they have different life outcomes than people that are not born premature. So even if you don't end up in the intensive care unit, you're more likely to end up with type 2 diabetes and metabolic disease and cardiovascular disease if you're born early. And you're also more likely to have a premature baby yourself. So hopefully you guys can see that the more people that have premature babies, the more premature babies there are going to be, and the more of an impact it has on our society and it has on our quality of life. And to me, that is an extremely powerful vocational thing that adds a different dimension to the research that I do. So when you look at the March of Dimes, the March of Dimes is one of those big charities that does a lot of work with prematurity. You see that Hawaii is really not doing very well, right? You look at the red and you're like, wow, Hawaii is not doing very well with our rates of prematurity. It's not even across the states on what is going on, right? So when we look at our rates of prematurity in Hawaii, we see it's around 10.6, and you see the March of Dimes give us a really bad grade. So I thought that would resonate with students. Like if you as a student got a D+, you would not be happy with that. And what that means is that our rates of prematurity are not getting better, no matter how hard we're working nationally to try and address this problem, because it's a health issue for everyone. And when you look at it, it's actually a health disparity. And one of the things that is a big driver for me is that what you see is that it's an African-American Pacific Islander problem in the islands. And I could talk about this for much longer than I'm going to, but this data is collected like this because of mainland ethnic demographics, right? We all know, like being in Hawaii or coming from Hawaii, that our Asian and Pacific Islander populations are quite different in terms of their pregnancy outcomes. And if this was for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, with the Asian populations taken out, this would be much worse. And there is data out there that absolutely supports that. So what I'm telling you is that this is something that our Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and actually Filipino ladies suffer from much more. And those populations are more impacted by this in terms of difficult pregnancies, in terms of survival of babies, in terms of long-term health outcomes, and then themselves being at risk of having babies themselves that are more likely to fall into this category, unfortunately, as well. And our state, the last time this ranking was done, was the worst state. It was ranked number 50 for this being a health disparity. So for me, you know, this is really powerful stuff. So I absolutely love the intricacy of the intellectual challenge, you know, figuring puzzles out. What does this fit like this? But equally, the social justice mission from this, for me, is extremely compelling. And the fact that trying to redress this by doing our research means that it can really impact future generations and future health is extremely like joy. That's where I get the joy from, that the thing where the experiments are not working, this is what gets me out of bed in the morning. This is what I find rewarding. This is what I'm more than happy to dedicate my intellectual career to really redress this. And so I'm gonna stop there. I mean, there's many things we could pick up on, but I'm happy to answer your questions on what it's like to be a scientist, what the nitty gritty is like, anything about prematurity you're interested, or even what it's like to grow up in a city like London.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wright, for all of that wonderful information and for obviously sharing your joy and passion with all of us. It's definitely inspiring to hear. If you do have questions, if any of the students or faculty on this call have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask them, or you can simply put it in the chat and we can talk about it there. If there are any, I'll give a minute or two if anyone has any questions.
Okay, so there's a good question. You want me to pick up on it, Eddie? Okay, so we don't really understand the unique combination of whether it's underlying health issues, so there is some of that, right? So there are some specific things that play into the prematurity, like the levels of diabetes in moms, not gestational diabetes, but just type 2 diabetes. You know, there are other rates of other like comorbidities, we would call it, things that do typically go wrong in pregnancy in certain groups, and that plays into it. But if you normalize pregnancies to that, we don't really understand right now the ethnic kind of disparity part of it. Now, some of that is going to be socioeconomic, and some of it is clearly not too. So it's one of those very messy data things, again, that I was talking about, that is really hard to tease out. One of the things that really convinced me recently that the access to healthcare and that as a socioeconomic thing, it really plays into some of our bad rates, was looking at the data of how we're faring in Honolulu and Maui and Kauai and Hawaii in terms of prematurity right now. And what we see is Oahu's not doing very well, right? Honolulu is not doing well, but partly that is because any unusual cases that happen, they get flown to Oahu, right? They get flown to Kapiolani, to Queens to be treated. So that changes the numbers a little bit. But what you see after that is Hawaii, the rates are going up, the island of Hawaii. And so when we think about who is living there and their access to healthcare and their access to pregnancy education and all of those things, there's some things I feel very passionately about too, because some of this could be redressed in health education and support and those things. But it's clearly a multifactorial thing where there's no easy cut and dry, like if we just do this, then we're going to fix this problem.
Let me ask just a follow-up question on that. How does the African-American disparity rate here compare with the mainland?
It's almost identical. It's almost identical. So if you look to the map that, like, I don't know if you remember, there was like a big red southern area, yeah, and you really see that. But what you see within those states are, again, access to healthcare, specific ethnic mixes, socioeconomic factors. But one of the things that I find interesting about that is actually the disparity is worse here. You know, and so there's, you know, and when you look at some of the other things that I've recently looked at, like for instance, the level of how many underinsured like pregnancies there are, or what was the other factor I was looking at? Levels of poverty. They're better here, as in we have more people that are insured and less people in poverty than some of those other states, which plays into that. So what that means is there becomes this dichotomy right here on mothers that are suffering and those that are not. And obviously the impact on their family, because if you have a premature baby, then that means hospital time, that means time away from your family, time away from your work. You may already have other children. It's extremely impactful to people's quality of life.
Again, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions or put them in the chat. I'm going to take the questioning to the other end of the spectrum and ask Dr. Wright, what are some things that you do to kind of help you think or clear your mind? Because sometimes we can be into a problem, like you've been saying about your data sets. What do you do to help you think more clearly or kind of get out of that headspace and see things with a fresh new eyes?
I think so. For me, exploring other creative things really helps. I mean, the kind of classic sort of persona of a scientist is very kind of logical and Dr. Spock, I don't know how else to put it, right? Like very logical, very kind of, but when you get to these, like you say, these data sets that are different, you have to be really creative. You have to start thinking about things differently. And what you see is usually people who are doing that kind of thing love the arts as well, right? Like Izzy knows I love dance, right? I love dance. I like the arts. I like sculpture. I like all kinds of things. And so those are the kinds of things I do. I try to clear my mind space with other things that are creative, that allow you to see things slightly differently. The other thing is really to keep going back to it. On different days, you have a different lens, you have a different mindset, you have a problem and you think, how could I have been stuck in that rut, that on that single track when there is so much more going on? So just appreciating that on different days you see things differently, you have a different outlook. We all feel like that, right, with different things. And so that really helps too. And sometimes that's why it takes a long time. But definitely, you know, for me, the arts is an escape. and it changes how you see things afterwards. It exercise. I mean, I could get all neuroscience on it, and I'm not going to. But you know, it's exercising different parts of your brain, and they're complementary.
Hi, Dr. Wright. I actually had a question for you as well.
Great.
So my question was, do you find that being a scientist, do you see yourself having like religion involved when you do your research, or is there like nothing at all?
There is. You know, I've had this conversation with many students before. You know, they're complementary. You know, to see the beauty in things, it's amazing. You know, it's to see the elegance of how things are fit together, and variety and all of that is amazing. It's mind-blowing, and they're not something that I see in conflict at all. You know, it's something I find easy to see as complementary. And so in terms of this, the spiritual responsibility I feel to communities, that's something that is real too. And I don't know if that answers your question. I hope so.
That does. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have another question for you, Dr. Wright.
Sure.
Well, again, on a different note, but did you ever see yourself teaching in Hawaii or ever leaving England at all?
No, it's totally weird. I mean, the high school I went to was not particularly academic, let's put it like that. I had about 250 kids in my year, and only me and one other person got postgraduate degrees. And with the wonder of social media, I know that's true. And when we kind of reconnected, you know, when social media started, like my classmates and I, they were all like, you really, you're the one who ended up like that? That's made me really think about, and you live in Hawaii, like in what world, you know, because it's not typical at all for where my family is and where my friends are. And I never dreamed that I would end up living on the other side of the world. And the one good thing about science is, because we do our best to share the information that we find out with each other, you know, that's our responsibility to humanity. You find out something that's cool that can help people, do not keep it to yourself. And so very quickly within grad school, I was going to conferences in America and in other places in Europe, and you see that traveling thing, and so that opened my eyes to it. But I never really thought I would end up leaving the country or living somewhere else on the other side of the world. And still I have friends from high school who kind of can't wrap their head around it. But it just makes me think that, you know, life, you have a plan in mind, and I didn't really have a strong plan, as you saw from my trajectory. I just kind of went from one thing to the next and made it up as I went along. You can't plan for some things. You just have to take your opportunities and be brave and just go for it, and it opens up things you could never imagine. Yeah, to my brother's children, I live on Dinosaur Island. Because I think all they know really about Hawaii is that that's where they filmed Jurassic Park. Okay, So I see another question in the chat. Is it all right if I do that?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So it says, what advice would you give to students in CUH in terms of health, well-being, and finding your love? I would say, don't box yourself in. That's the advice I give to students all the time. Always make sure you explore your options. And don't close doors on yourself. Keep your options open. That's one of the biggest things for sure. I started doing my physiology degree because I wanted to do the sports and exercise physiology part of it. That's why I started doing it. But very quickly, I realized that it wasn't where my interest was at that time. I took one class in neuro and I was like, I am hooked. This is so challenging and this is super interesting. And my goodness, like, why do people do that? That's like, and so understanding how that worked, at the cellular level was fascinating to me and also challenging. So I learned something about my personality there. Like, I like a good challenge. So just knowing yourself and allowing yourself to explore different things that maybe you think you wouldn't like is how you figure out your pathway. If you get too locked in, then you're shutting doors and you may end up not where you want to be, or what suits you, or what's true to you. And that's important. Having joy in your vocation is I feel so privileged to that. I have to say, like, I would say all of my family members do jobs that they do not love, or did jobs that they do not love. And when we talk and joke about retirement and those kinds of things, I can't imagine retiring because I love what I do. I can imagine slowing down because that's aging, right? But I'm so privileged in that I love what I do. So it's not about that. And I see so many people that just have the reality of having to pay their bills and look after their family, and they don't have that vocation. They don't have that truth to themselves of what they could really achieve and the joy they could have in it. And yeah, so that's what I want for all you guys to find that. It doesn't matter what it is.
I have one more question for you, Dr. Wright.
Sure.
You did talk about a little bit earlier about your decision to come to Chaminade and meeting with Dr. Turner. So could you kind of talk more about like why you decided to come to Chaminade? What were some of the personal decisions or some things that you saw about the university that made you decide to make the switch?
Yeah, so just before I moved here, like you said in my introduction, thank you, that I was the primary neuroanatomy instructor for the med students. And on one level, I loved that. It was hard teaching human dissection to a group of 80 students in one room, just me. That was a little bit tricky. And also the lecturing part. But what I saw was, even though, some of the teaching they do at that school is on a small group basis, right? Some of the classes are literally the whole year in a class, right? So 80 students in a class, like, 65 to 80, it depends on the year. And what I saw on the kind of academic level was this drive to a profession, and not so much the love of science anymore. And so while I enjoy teaching medical type things, right, like the diseases that are fascinating and what's going on with what's the progress of the disease and how different people react differently, and some of those questions are fascinating to me, what I saw with that kind of level of professional school student was was this kind of drive to, I must pass the standardized exam, and and that's all I care about. And any love of science for science sake, there was no space for that at that time. And so that's what I love about teaching undergraduate students, is the fact that you have this time in your life where you can explore different things, and you're not in that locked in space at that time. You can say, hey, well, I wonder if this is like this and that's like that. You're not trying to learn things for a standardized exam. So even though I still guest lecture at UH, and I still interact with the medical students, and I still teach in their graduate programs a little bit, and even actually to physicians that are in fellowship at Capilani, they're just different things. But what I decided is that I wanted to go back to teaching science to people who love it, who are fascinated by it, as the majority of the teaching that I did. And then also I saw that my research, my kind of passion and my vocation for the social injustice in health disparities was something that would be supported in a different way at Chaminade than I found at the medical school at that time. I mean, subsequently, I'm working now. I've been working with a grant for a while with the Department of Native Hawaiian Health at the medical school. And that looks very positive, where we're trying to start a program to really look at health disparities and really moving the needle on some of these things in Hawaii and in Oahu and the other islands and the outer Pacific islands. But at the time, I felt like this was definitely the best place for me, that I could really kind of attack this issue with the student body, that the students themselves would be far more kind of, they would feel closer to it, right? As something that I felt passionate about, given the differences between who the students are at the medical school and who the students are that we have. Yeah. So it was a super easy decision.
Thank you for we have time for maybe one last question, if there's any from our audience here today.
I'd like to maybe ask a final question. Dr. Wright, we're all preoccupied with this pandemic, and there's been a lot of concern about the vaccines and that sort of thing, and hesitation on people's parts. Any advice that you have?
That's a difficult one, right? Because it has to be everybody's personal decision for their own health. One of the things that I find quite compelling is that all of the science faculty were immediately like, "Where's my vaccine?" and so if that gives you confidence that those people that fully understand science are comfortable, then you could use that to increase your level of comfort. People that are molecular biologists, are working and have done their PhDs studying DNA and messenger RNA, which is the new form of vaccine, they understand as much as the people that made the vaccine, not about vaccine production or whatever, but how it works and what we understand. And that, I think, to my mind, speaks volumes, that if they're all comfortable, then you should think about why that is, and then make your own choice and your own comfort level. I mean, I know there are some people who they have reactions, right? They have a much stronger reaction. They have a slight difference in their immune system. You have to take that very seriously too. But what we see in the way that the vaccine was produced was that it's not that the way it was tested for safety was different. It's that the red tape in place administratively was removed. to a greater extent so that the timeline could be accelerated. And so you have to ask yourself, like, how comfortable are you? What is the best decision? And go with that. And I'm not about to tell everyone they need to need to have the vaccine at all, but just to say, to give you the confidence that, you know, those folks that understand science, they're comfortable. Does that help?
Yeah, that's good. Another aspect that I think about is it also has a social dimension, because it's not just myself, it's everybody I come in contact with as well. So that has to also be factored in terms of how responsible I'm being, not only for myself, but for everybody else in this.
Yes, that's part of the equation, right? That you have to put into your decision-making process as an individual. The fact that, you know, if more people get vaccinated, those people that cannot, because it's risky for them, because they have these highly reactive immune systems, that will be fine. You know, if we reach what they're calling herd immunity, if we reach that, then those people will be safe. So you could absolutely make the argument that it's your social responsibility to protect those people around you. But that's again, that's your personal decision. And the more people that, you know, the thing that the vaccine does that a lot of people don't realize, and I heard this really awesome analogy, was it's like putting on a pair of gloves. So if you put on a pair of gloves, you don't get dirty yourself, right? But you can still spread it around with your gloves, right? So really, vaccination in the beginning is about stopping yourself from being sick. But if you get to the point where there are no people, there are way less people that can get infected, then that virus has nowhere to live, and it cannot live without a home. So that's the powerful thing about vaccination and herd immunization. So, you know, if you're comfortable, then you are ultimately protecting your kapuna, your family, your loved ones, everybody. But that's your decision, right? Like how you manage that.
Thank you, Father Marty, for those questions, and Dr. Wright for your answers and your responses. So we're about the end. So I would like to ask Father Marty if he'd close us out in a prayer, and that would be the end of our Share the Joy today. So again, thank you to Dr. Wright, to all of our students and faculty who are on this call, and we can hopefully take away some of this wisdom and inspiration and apply it to our own lives and to our own academics even, and see where the path takes us.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lord, for this time together. Thank you for Dr. Wright, for her clarity, her professionalism, and her love for science. Please help us all to appreciate the poetry of reality. Help us to continue growing as a Chaminade Ohana, to care for each other, to stay safe, and to protect others. Please bless us and bless all the students at this university. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thanks, Dr. Wright. Excellent.
No problem. It was nice to see all you students, see all your little boxes.
Thank you.